You know, they say life is like a hurricane in Duckberg. Race cars, lasers, aeroplanes, it can be quite a duck blur. Back in the 90s, the Disney afternoon was the thing to watch after school. Chippendale, Rescue Rangers, Tailspin, Goof Troop, Darkwing Duck, and, of course, DuckTales. Disney was really at the top of their game, on TV and, of course, in the movie theaters. In the midst of that renaissance, it's easy to overlook the other medium Disney was exploring, video games. The early 90s was also a golden age for video games, with the SNES and the Sega Genesis battling for supremacy through the first half of the decade. And Disney was in the thick of that battle, releasing all kinds of video games featuring all of their most popular characters on both consoles. There were, of course, the movie tie-in games like The Lion King and Aladdin, then there were the Mickey games like Castle of Illusion, and of course, plenty of games based on the Disney afternoon. Pretty much every show got its own video game, but I'm not here to talk about any of those. This is Quackshot, a platform adventure game starring Donald Duck that is a DuckTales game in everything but name. Quackshot is an interesting little game that tried to be more than just another stock side-scroller made by a director that would go on to produce one of the craziest crossover series ever, and the artist that designed the most famous echidna ever. So come with me as I take a look at a forgotten little Genesis game from 1991. I'm going to pick this game apart and analyze the choices the developers made, and along the way we might just solve a mystery. And if we're very lucky, we could rewrite the history of Disney video games. Normally, I'd start by talking about the development of this game, but after some digging, I came up completely empty. That's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video. There are plenty of videos out there about the more famous games, the Marios, the Sonics, the Mega Men, but there are also so many games out there that are fated to be lost to history, especially the licensed games. And frankly, there's a good reason for that. A lot of licensed games are just bad. I mean, really bad. I can't count the number of times I was burned at Blockbuster by a game featuring some of my favorite characters. It was just so easy at the time to slap a famous character on a game and then not put a lot of effort into actually developing it into something good. But even then, back in the early 90s, we hadn't reached the PlayStation era of peak horrible shovelware just yet. The video game industry was still growing, still figuring out what made a game good to begin with. Games were also made by much smaller teams, which led them to be a lot more experimental. Making games back then was closer to indie development than the large AAA or even mid-tier modern games. That said, this is no independent game. In fact, this game was made by Sega, you know, the Sonic people. Actually, Quackshot is such an obscure game that that's about all I could figure out about it. This was still an era where game companies did not talk about development much, especially in Japan. It was fairly common to not even let developers credit themselves with their own names. For instance, take the game designer and director, credited in-game as Emerine. This is actually Emiko Yamamoto, the director of Castle of Illusion, who would go on to work for Disney directly and become the executive producer for a little series called Kingdom Hearts. Then there's the art director credited as Thomas Yuda, real name Takeshi Yuda. He would go on to design a new rival for Sonic the Hedgehog, an echidna named Knuckles. They were part of a small team of around a dozen developers that worked on a trilogy of Genesis games: Castle of Illusion, World of Illusion, which I have talked about before in my Game of the Year series, and in between those two we have Quackshot. So, let's take a look at the game they made, the only one of these three to star Donald as the sole main character. The first thing we see as the game begins is that classic Sega logo, something I always took as a sign of quality back in the day. Next, we have a flickering light, revealed to be a torch held by Donald Duck. He's sneaking through a mysterious cavern, the cool blue of the natural rock contrasting with the warm rock of carved columns. Donald himself is dressed in a classic explorer outfit, a tan shirt and hat in an obvious reference to Indiana Jones paired with a green backpack for contrast. No pants, obviously. He's a duck. We also get a cast introduction in the same style of a movie's opening credits. This is a really interesting choice, presenting the game like a cinematic experience. We have most of the usual suspects here: Donald and Daisy, Huey, Dewey, Louie, Uncle Scrooge and Gyro, but also Goofy. No Mickey Mouse this time around. Donald sees something exciting off screen and sets off running, only to fall into a pit right before reaching the treasure. And that's Donald to a T, a little excitable and not especially careful. As Donald falls, a map drifts into frame on the screen. The map itself is pretty interesting, depicting a world very similar to our own. I especially like that the map is incomplete, clearly coming from an age of exploration where they didn't have the whole world mapped out. That western coast of the US and East Asia in particular are clearly guesses by the map maker. The ornamentation is also quite nice, with a duck seal that seems to depict some kind of ruler, some ships bearing St. George's Cross, and another crest showing another one of those ships, and some kind of bird. Fitting for a duck monarch, but this bird looks much more majestic. All the markers here are very specific. This is a map that was crafted by someone who had explored the far corners of the world. Of course, the big highlight is the title, The Great Duck Treasure. But we'll get to that soon, because it's time for the title screen. Donald walks out and shoots his plunger gun to summon the title, Quackshot. Here we get another very obvious nod to Indiana Jones, with the font and color gradient a direct reference to Raiders of the Lost Ark. Finally, Huey, Dewey, and Louie fly in on an airplane pulling a banner announcing Donald Duck as the star. It's a nice, thematically appropriate, and colorful title screen. Pressing start takes us to this simple menu, and selecting start here will take us to a cutscene that lays out the story. Apparently, while Scrooge was napping from one of his own adventures, Donald pilfered the library and discovered a legend about King Garuzia, the king of an ancient duck kingdom. It seems King Garuzia had left behind a hidden treasure when he died, and the book contains a map said to lead to the treasure. Donald is seeing dollar signs, but unfortunately one of Pete's goons was lurking nearby and somehow overheard the entire thing. Does Scrooge not have security? Where's Launchpad and Mrs. Beakley? Anyway, Donald takes the triplets and sets off to find the treasure, even though he already had dinner plans with Daisy. Donald promises to bring her back a surprise and heads out, with Pete hot on his trail. That leads us back to the map, which will now surface our level select screen. Quackshot is a non-linear game, but for now we only have 3 options. Duckberg, which seems to be in California, Mexico, an astonishingly vague location, and Transylvania. Sounds perfectly safe. Let's start out with Duckberg and head into our first level. The boys drop Donald off and we're into a fairly straightforward platforming level. Donald has a fairly floaty jump with good air control, nothing crazy here. His crouch, however, is pretty interesting. Instead of a slow crawl, they gave Donald this weird dive. I wasn't sure what this was about, but I think it's meant to evoke those moments when a character dives under a closing door in adventure movies. Donald does also have a run button, but in most cases the crouch dive is actually the fastest way to move. Since this is a Disney game, Donald needs an appropriately benign weapon, so he's equipped with a plunger gun. This is a very cartoony weapon, shooting out plungers in a straight line that stick to whatever object they land on. This has some unique applications that'll pop up later in the game, but for now, the plunger gun can't kill enemies, but it will stun them for a few seconds so that Donald can get past them. This first level takes place on the streets of Duckberg, and it seems Pete has sent his goons out to stop Donald. These standard enemies stand in place holding guns, shooting infrequently. It looks like their ammo is actually tomatoes, which doesn't seem especially dangerous, but it will take a pip off your power meter. This is basically a life bar. Lose all the pips and you'll lose a life and be sent back to the last checkpoint, which is usually the beginning of whatever screen you're on. They aren't a big threat if you are careful, but they can easily catch you off guard if you are distracted by platforming. The way these first 2 are positioned is interesting. They're both placed on boxes above the street, but Donald starts out on a higher platform so that he is lined up with the first one. That puts him in position to get shot, but when you get to the second one, you'll be down on ground level so the goon will shoot right over you. It seems they wanted you to get caught off guard by the first goon before they give you a chance to observe this second one in relative safety, giving you the opportunity to choose when to jump in and engage. This third goon is placed even higher, but he's also carrying a satchel. Hitting an enemy like this with a weapon will cause them to drop whatever they are holding, and I have to say, I really like this. It lets you see at a glance which enemies are holding items, so if you are short on health, you have a good idea of where to get more. I actually can't think of a single other game that has a visual indicator that an enemy will drop an item. Let me know in the comments if you can think of one. Speaking of items, all of your health pickups in this game are food. Ice cream will heal 1 health, but this whole chicken will completely fill your health. Let's just not think about the implications of a duck eating a chicken. That's not natural. Past this point, the path branches ever so slightly, with this ladder leading up to these windowsills where Donald can grab these peppers. And that means it's time to talk about the temper meter. Donald is well known for his explosive temper, and each pepper you grab will heat him up cartoon style. When that meter fills up, Donald will completely flip his shit, dashing off across the level and plowing through any enemy he touches. Donald is completely invulnerable in this state, and he can climb up walls, so it makes for a fun little rush of energy where you can dash through the level and get some easy progress. This power-up only appears a handful of times in the game, but it is very true to Donald's characterization, so it's a fun inclusion. It's also a twist on the Mario Starman because you need to gather multiple items to achieve this angry state. And I do like that idea of his temperature rising slowly until his anger finally boils over. With that middle section skipped, we're almost done with this level. We just need to dodge these worms that jump between trash cans, and we're at the end. Here, Donald runs into this Professor Explorer guy, and he tells us that we can't move forward without some additional equipment. And that means it's time to talk about this game's structure a bit. The actual levels are fairly straightforward affairs. Mostly. But each level is split into multiple sections that are blocked off without the right key or equipment. That's right, it's baby's first Metroidvania, where instead of a big interconnected world, you have individual levels separated out. A new player is presented with these first 3 maps and allowed to pick whichever they like, but whichever one you do pick, you'll be running into a dead end. I'll analyze this more in depth later on. For now, we need to leave this level. Fortunately, we don't need to hike back to the beginning. The game does not actually have much backtracking because when you reach the midpoint of a level, Donald will drop this little flag. This serves as a landing point for the triplets, and if you go into the menu, you can call for a pickup. They'll fly in and take us right back out to the map. Now we can choose from either of the other 2 levels, and if you're like me, Transylvania doesn't sound especially inviting. So off to Mexico we go. And apparently they mean northern Mexico because it's desert all the way to the horizon, including this cactus enemy. These guys will explode if you get too close, so make sure to plunge them from a distance. Moving to the right past the cacti and goons, the game introduces a bird enemy. These guys fly overhead and attempt to drop bees on you.
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees!
This level also features the classic video game desert feature of quicksand. Quackshot changes this up by including antlions, these bug things that live in sand pits. These guys for some reason are holding blocks that they can throw into the air, and Donald can jump across these to stay out of the quicksand. This is also a good chance to look at 2 more power-ups. The hat is a 1-up, another nod to Indiana Jones and how much he likes his hat. There's also money, which you might have seen in other places already. That's a holdover for when points still mattered in video games. Honestly, they don't really add much of anything to this game. And then there's also this corn icon, which turns out to be ammo, but I'll talk about that in a second. Past some more sand pits and cacti, we move on to the next section, and the sun has begun to set, casting the level in a warm golden hue. We're also moving up some rocky cliffs now, presenting the first real platforming challenges of the game. These pits will be an instant loss in life, but there's plenty of time to take things slow. We also see a new enemy, this turtle with boxing gloves. Why does he have boxing gloves? Is he going to punch you? Nope. Cartoons are weird. As the level proceeds, we start to get to some moving platforms. They aren't especially quick, but they do require more timing. There are also these dynamite fuse things that set off a chain reaction when you walk past them, but as long as you keep moving, Donald will outpace them. It just adds a little extra pressure to keep moving. The last escalation the level throws at you are moving platforms with a bird flying overhead and a goon shooting at you. Fortunately, Donald doesn't have any knockback when he's hit, he just freezes in air for a moment. This game would be so much harder with knockback. Past this section, we move on to the next screen. We're back down out of the cliffs now and back down into the desert. We soon encounter a temple that is meant to be Mayan, I guess? Wrong part of Mexico for that, but let's move past that. A local lets Donald know he needs a key to open the temple up, and wouldn't you know that is back in Duckberg. Once again, we are saved from backtracking, as Huey, Dewey, and Louie can pick us up from here and drop us right back off next to the professor. He's happy to hand over the key, and we can fly right back to the temple. This little diversion ensures that no matter which of these 2 levels you pick first, you will need to partially complete them both to enter this temple. You will then need to complete them fully to make much progress in Transylvania. The game uses this to give you freedom to explore the map and see what the levels have to offer, while also making sure you learn the basics of the gameplay from those levels before throwing the more challenging Transylvania dungeon at you. With the key in hand, we can make our way into the temple. However, we do need to go into the menu and manually use the key as if we were playing an adventure game. This can feel clunky from a modern perspective, but it reminds me of playing games like Maniac Mansion. Inside, the temple seems to be infested by some kind of fire spirits. You need to guide Donald carefully through this hallway, up a ladder, and then down this slope, all while dodging these flames. They don't move very fast, but you do need to do a little work to avoid damage on this slope. Past this, we get to a new mechanic. These moving duck-faced platforms will hurt Donald if he touches them, but if he hits them with the plunger, they will freeze and he can jump on them safely. This makes for an interesting platform challenge that requires you to freeze enemies strategic at specific points in their movement to climb up these vertical shafts. Very reminiscent of Samus's Ice Beam, actually. Just don't expect Donald to get a screw attack. At the top of this brief climb, we encounter some unhappy locals. These guys throw flames at Donald in an arc, making them a more challenging enemy. This is a good opportunity to show off the popcorn gun. You have to go into the menu to switch weapons, and selecting the popcorn gun reveals that it shoots in a wide spread like a shotgun. This weapon doesn't freeze enemies, it removes them from the screen, making it more useful than the plunger gun in some cases. This is balanced out by requiring ammo, and it's 5 kernels per shot, so you run through it real quick if you aren't careful. Best to save it up for larger threats. After Donald introduces these locals to the wonders of colonialization, we can head down this ladder and get to our first narrow passage. This is where that duck dive move is meant to be used, and it has an interesting complication. Donald will always move at a set distance, so when you need to find your way into a narrow passageway, you need to wiggle back and forth so Donald stops in the right position. I can't say I've ever seen a crawl mechanic like this, but it has the benefit of not being painfully slow like crawling in some other games. It also serves as a mini puzzle, which counts for something. The rest of this temple elaborates on the challenges we have seen so far. More of these platforms to climb up and more tight passageways to navigate. These later ones complicate things by including blocks you need to dodge. This last climb is especially difficult. Counterintuitively, you need to freeze the block lower due to the low ceiling, or you won't get enough height due to Donald's jump arc. Past this section, we're at the deepest part of the temple, and Donald runs into a friendly face. Goofy! As near as I can tell, he's on vacation. He's dressed in a Hawaiian shirt and looks like he's just wandered in here without a care for the dangers Donald faced. Very appropriate for Goofy. He's always easygoing. Goofy gives us a mysterious note and a plunger upgrade, also letting us know we should head back to Gyro and Duckberg. Or is that Gyro? Anyway, Donald says goodbye to Goofy until Kingdom Hearts, and we're off to our next destination. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut back out of the temple, so we have to go the long way. They did at least remove the block thing so you don't get hit dropping down the shafts. It's interesting that for a game that limits backtracking so much, they force you to do it here. In general, I prefer when games give you alternate routes on the return trip, which this game even does in some cases. I don't think this particular return trip adds much to the game, and I'm curious why they designed it this way. Back outside the temple, we can hop a plane back to Duckberg and put our new red plungers to work. These ones can stick to walls, forming platforms that Donald can climb. This lets us continue on to the rest of Duckberg. This area is all about making good use of the plunger upgrade, which is functionally a pretty unique wall climb. The plungers have to be placed before you jump, which does limit your mobility compared to a standard wall jump. I honestly can't think of another mobility mechanic where you need to set your platform before you jump. I feel like if you wanted to, you could do something interesting with a mechanic like this, but Quackshot uses it in a pretty straightforward way. Except, as I was editing this video, I found an indie game called One Arrow that uses that exact concept. In that game, you have an arrow you can freeze in midair to use as a platform. I actually asked the game's creator if he had ever heard of Quackshot, and it turns out he hadn't. So it's really just an interesting coincidence. So I guess check out that game on Steam if that sounds interesting. Anyway, this area features several tall buildings to climb up to test drive this ability. This is complicated by these speakers that shoot out dangerous onomatopoeia. Boom indeed. This section also featured the turtles from earlier to better effect, this time with narrow pathways that get complicated when the turtles retreat into their shells. Man, Mario would never have trouble with something like this. You have to peg these guys with a plunger before they can protect themselves or back away to coax them out of their shells. Past this area, we get to the first of the game's action interludes. This one features a series of power lines and a wheel you can cling to ride across. You do need to jump between wires a few times to avoid frayed wiring, which can be complicated because the wheels double back on themselves. I'll also point out that the twilight background here is quite pretty. The game has a couple of sections like this, and they make for a fun diversion from the standard platforming. At the end of this section, we'll find Gizmo, who gives us bubblegum ammo. This is a weapon with very specific applications, but we'll talk about that when it comes into play. The return wire is pretty simple. You can ride this wheel back with zero complications. You will unfortunately need to retreat through the tall buildings of the previous section without any shortcuts, and I find it unfortunate that this section is not any different on the return trip. Oh well, it's finally time to head to Transylvania. I wonder what dangers we'll face here. Bleh, bleh. Landing in Transylvania, we are apparently in some kind of swamp, and I had to look into this. My research tells me this probably doesn't exist in the real-life mountainous country of Transylvania. There isn't much of interest in this first section, just some goons shooting at us and some bats looking to sneak up on us. The vibe here is definitely a bit creepier than the last two levels. Once we make it through the swamp, we encounter a castle, and Donald is quick to spoil the suspense and announce that it is Dracula's castle. But it was hardly much of a surprise to begin with. Who else's castle would it have been? Let's head inside to confront him. This front hallway demonstrates why we had to do this level last, as in order to proceed, we need the bubblegum ammo. Before we get to that, we encounter a ghost that informs us that the Count has a map to the treasure, so that's handy. The game employs NPCs in most levels to make sure we know where to go next. To get into the castle proper, we need to use the bubblegum ammo, which can destroy specific kinds of blocks. You know, the ones that are a different color, as if they were the one background object in a cartoon that can move. The bubblegum ammo gets us in, but getting deeper into the castle means dealing with these ghosts. There is nothing Donald can do to stop them, so the only viable strategy is to avoid them as they float slowly towards you. Moving forward, we also encounter barrels that can be destroyed by bubbles, and these can lead to situations where you can build your route through a wall of barrels. Often there are items hidden within these if you take the time to search, but I went straight through. Further on, we get to some coffins with skeletons popping out of them. Very spooky. The skeletons attack by throwing their skull at you, which can really catch you off guard. This is a more challenging enemy because you need to jump to hit its weak point. I should also mention the art in this level. The paintings of Dracula with moving eyes are quite creepy and very appropriate for this sort of setting, and I actually like these purple tapestries quite a bit. A good splash of color and the way they are artfully tattered really sells the age of this castle. The atmosphere here feels very creepy, but in that Scooby-Doo cartoony way where the danger seems fun and not scary. This game was meant for kids, after all. The rest of this corridor is variations of what we have seen so far, until at the end we drop down a hole and end up underwater. I mean, you'd think as a duck, Donald would float, but at the very least he doesn't need oxygen. Donald moves very slowly underwater, forcing you to really plan your slow motion jumps. There are plenty of swinging balls to avoid and a number of tricky jumps between spikes. There are also 2 opportunities to use your plungers to take higher routes, but I'm not sure if they are easier or harder. The second one at least has some items to collect. Climbing out of the water, we run into a new ghost, this Benjamin Franklin-looking mofo that floats just out of range. Weirdly, he seems to be human and not a duck. That's actually very strange for this universe. He's really obnoxious because after a few seconds he will burst into smaller ghosts that will swarm the screen. These are tricky to dodge, so it's often better to keep moving to limit the time you are exposed to this guy. This hallway also features a secret route. If you break these blocks, there will be one that doesn't break, and you can ride that up to a higher level. Honestly, I'm not even sure how you're supposed to find this. I just remembered from when I was a kid. Hopefully you'll be curious enough to use your bubblegum ammo on everything you see and notice that this block doesn't disappear. This upper section leads through some narrow passageways where you need to dodge more ghosts, then there's some skeletons, and out of nowhere a trap where you need to climb a wall quickly before this other wall closes in. It's a nice little moment of tension that kinda comes out of nowhere, but it's not too hard to avoid. After this corridor, we move on to another one protected by a big ghost, and this one also has a secret exit. The difference is that this is the mandatory path. It's hidden in the ceiling right here, so hopefully you're paying attention or you will be going around in circles for a while. This part of the game rewards observation, and you need to not destroy these blocks to get up here. Definitely a more tricky moment, reminiscent of the Mario World ghost houses. Climbing up here, we find a metal door, and inside is our first boss, Dracula. The Count floats high above us, protecting himself with his cape. Ever so often he will spread his cape and attack you with summoned bats, and that's your chance to smack him in the face with a plunger. I know, it's not a stake, but we work with the weapons we have. That's really all this boss has to offer. The real challenge here is the erratic movement of the bats. Considering this is the first boss of the game, this feels like a reasonable challenge, one simple loop of behavior to learn and react to. Overall, this level does a good job of feeling like a step up. A spooky castle filled with ghosts and a boss fight against the world's most famous vampire, who also happens to be a duck. Unfortunately, I do think this boss fight sort of undersells the threat of Dracula after a good atmospheric level. Anyway, after enough plunger hits, Drac will be defeated, and Donald can claim the real treasure map. We are led outside the castle, once again without the need to backtrack, and after getting a pickup from the triplets, we can see our new map. We now have 4 more locations to explore, and it is such a weird, eclectic grouping of locations. We have Egypt, a whole country that is presumably important because of the pyramids, the Majarajah, which is just a title for an Indian prince and not a location at all, a Viking Ship, which is weirdly specific and vague at the same time, and then the South Pole, which will surely not be a difficult area to properly explore for a pantsless duck. Let's start out in Egypt. As soon as we land, we have pyramids in the background, crumbling walls covered in hieroglyphics, and goons in turbans to match the location. This level features more quicksand, birds, blocks to navigate protected by turtles, these weird guys hiding in the sand, no clue what's going on there, best to just avoid them. Eventually, we find our way to a tomb we can't open yet. It does give us a flag though, so we can head off to find our key. Our next step is the Majarajah, a very green level set in a well-developed city. I guess this is all supposed to be jade? Highlights of this level include more peppers to send Donald over the edge, snake charmers that summon snakes that just look like Kaa from the Jungle Book, and a lot of intricate decorations. At the end of this path, we reach a palace that is the residence of a fancy duck that I can only assume is the Majarajah, and wouldn't you know, he has the key we need. He agrees to give it to us if we can deal with his tiger problem, so into the palace we go. This level is structured like a maze. There are a series of rooms that each contain a number of doors, and each of those doors will lead to a different room. A lot of these doors will just take you back to the first room, and that leads to a lot of trial and error as you figure out the correct route through this level. Generally, you want to avoid the most obvious door and find the one that is a bit more obscure, but even that can be a bit subjective. As long as you keep trying different doors, you'll make it to the garden eventually and run into a much more challenging boss. This tiger is a jerk. He'll leap from one side of the room to the other, and you'll need to peg him in the head to do damage to him. The way hitting an enemy works in this game means he freezes in midair each time he strikes, and that can make dodging and timing your attacks kind of awkward. He also breathes fire, which is totally normal. The only way I found to dodge it is to duck right next to him before the cone of the fire spreads out more. After you hit him a few times, he will jump up onto these higher platforms and rain hot fire down upon you, and this is especially hard to dodge. You actually kind of need to fake him out because this fire will aim at whichever corner you are standing in at the time. This ferocious feline definitely took me a few attempts, but with persistence you can put him down and claim the Sphinx tier from the Majarajah. Did this guy not have servants that could have just dealt with this? Good help is so hard to find. Oh well, with this jewel in hand we can return to Egypt and unlock the tomb. This part of the level leans heavily into the Egyptian tomb filled with traps trope. We start out with these moving towers you need to climb quickly before they crush you into spikes. One level up, we have these spikes in the floor that shoot up to stab you, and these are really mean. You can run by the first set of spears safely, but the next spear anticipates you and stabs you. Functionally, there are two kinds of spears, one that activates after you pass it, and one that anticipates you. There's no way to tell which is which without testing them, which does complicate the issue a bit. And this forces you to test the traps as if you were actually exploring a treacherous tomb. Well, you know, one from a movie, that is. I somehow doubt real tombs work this way. The whole game does kind of work on movie logic. Further on we have some narrow passageways to navigate and more of those fire throwers, this time in more Egyptian attire. Climbing up to the next level, there's an interesting downward slope where the spikes force you to keep moving right towards a pit of fire. I like the tempo here, a threat pushing you to make a split-second decision. Very adventurous. Next you need to climb back up a slope protected by spikes, only to fall down a hidden pit. Fortunately there are some pickups here to grab and you can climb back out to move on to the next area. This section really turns up the heat with more fire pits. To cross it, you need to jump carefully and dodge the moving flames. This escalates further with a series of collapsing bridges you need to run across and more platforms with falling flames to dodge. The next scene features a new trap, a series of fireballs that chase you through narrow corridors. You'll need to move quickly through each of these hallways or Donald will become roast duck. I really like how strong the theme of traps is in this level. There are a number of unique elements that all tie into it. This level more than most manages to capture that Indiana Jones energy of dodging traps with the skin of your teeth as you run through a temple. This section even ends with a risky jump where you narrowly escape this flame pit. You know, as long as you're still holding right. But we have one more puzzle to solve, and this one is pretty unique. This room will lock as soon as we enter it, and the ceiling will begin descending to crush Donald. We've actually had the solution to this trap for a while. It's this note that Goofy gave us a few levels back. This is a tricky puzzle because it requires you to actually read the note, remember the clue, connect it to the symbols on these blocks, and realize what it means. The game wants you to activate these blocks in the correct order by jumping off of them, but even that is mysterious because there isn't anything else you activate in the game in this way. This is a tricky thing to evaluate because on the one hand, I like that you get this clue earlier in the game and then you have to figure out where to apply it. Depending on what order you choose to tackle these levels, it could be quite a while between these points, and that really challenges players to think critically. On the other hand, there isn't really anything else in the game that works quite like this, so the game hasn't really trained you for this. In the early game, NPCs pretty much tell you exactly where to go, so this is definitely a step up in difficulty. The game also puts you under a great deal of stress to figure this out, because there is very little time to think through this before you are crushed. How many children would have thought to check their inventory in a situation like this? In any case, once you figure out this dastardly puzzle, you can climb up to collect the Scepter of Ra! And this time the game does give us a shortcut back. Climbing down this ladder we find Donald falling into a minecart section. Come on, how can a game be bad if it has a minecart section? This one is pretty short, you just need to jump to the next cart after each gap. The ground may look solid, but you'll fall right through without the minecart. This section drops us outside the tomb. How convenient! Now we can call for pickup and head to our next destination. We're going to tackle the Viking Ship next, and this is such a cool, moody level. The music is mysterious and adventurous, and the moon amidst the clouds really sells the vibe. In fact, this game has very good art overall, and this is a good time to highlight it. There is a clear attempt in this game to make it look like Donald had jumped right out of a cartoon. His sprite is expressive and well animated with a lot of attention to character. Look at his idle animation, for example. It has more frames than his walk cycle, and you can really feel his irritation here. They also employed a pretty fantastic smear frame on his shooting animation. This is a classic cartooning strategy to imitate motion blur. Touches like this make the game feel less constrained by the pixels it is built from. You start to see more of the underlying hand-drawn art, and it has a bit of that classic Disney vibe. This becomes more clear if you compare Donald to, say, my buddy Yoshi. Now, I'm no sprite expert, but side by side you can see that there was more of an attempt at blending on Donald, which gives him more depth. It's a kind of detailed sprite work that is pretty common now, but was not common at all in 1991. Even compared to Mickey's Castle of Illusion, a game made by the same team 1 year earlier, you can see a big jump in detail over Mickey's sprite. It's amazing what a difference a year could make back then. The backgrounds especially can be quite beautiful, using bright, pleasing colors. Duckberg has that classic Toontown look to it, with chunky architectural details without becoming too exaggerated. The locations Donald travels to are exotic and varied, and the art supports that. The vistas out in the wilderness levels are quite pretty, with bright blue skies and detailed rockwork almost begging to be explored. But the game is at its most ambitious when they play with light. I highlighted this before, but look at the way this map is cast in the beautiful gold of a sunset, that perfect golden hour. Then there is this high wire map set at twilight, the sky darkening into an array of colors in those brief minutes before night falls. This one, though, is my favorite. A vast canyon just as dawn breaks. There's so many lovely purples in the shadows, and the early morning sun's reflecting gold off the rocks. It's magnificent. But we'll get back to that towards the end of the game. For now, let's get back to the Viking ship. This level is full of Vikings trying to skewer you with arrows, and it's one of the few examples I can think of where a game features Viking archers. This level also features a section up among the masts where you need to climb through the rigging and ride across ropes. Some of Pete's goons have also made it up here somehow. Actually, how long has this ship been here if it's on a very old map? After making it through this section, Donald returns to the deck only to find the ship's captain, who informs us that his ship has been captured by ghosts. How long has this guy been here tied up like this? He promises to give us a diary that can point us to the locked treasure, but only if we can rescue his ship. For that, we need a key to get inside, and for that, we need to travel to the only location left on the map, the South Pole. How did a Viking end up that far south anyway? They were from the Northern Hemisphere. Well, we're at the South Pole, and that means it's time for ice physics. Quackshot complicates things by adding in slopes, which is a little mean. The game positions goons at the top of hills and also throws penguins at us. They slide down the slopes to attack our duck hero. This whole section isn't too bad as long as you time your plunger shots. At the end of this section, we find a chunk of ice with something inside of it. This little puzzle is a lot easier if you know who Ra is, because we can use the sun god's staff to melt this ice and obtain the Viking key. We also get a green flag, so we can fly right back to the Viking ship and head inside. The interior of the ship is another puzzle. If you follow the obvious path, it will take you in a big circle. The only thing of note on this loop is this bigger goon that runs around trying to tackle you. He has this gag where he's sucking in his gut, but he's also completely plunger-proof. What the game wants you to realize as you explore this ship is that there is an open area in this stack of barrels. If you can notice that, hopefully you can intuit that you can find a way to this door, and it so happens that there is a hidden passageway through these barrels. If you've seen my Yoshi video, you might already know that I like when a game shows you a secret and then challenges you to find your way there. Once you reach this room and head inside, the boss music kicks off, so it's time to battle. This time we're up against some kind of haunted Viking warrior. He holds his shield to block your shots and hurls a hammer at you boomerang style. I wish I could tell you how I figured this out, but the popcorn gun is really effective here. Nailing him with these kernels will cause him to fall apart, only to reform and jump across the screen as a stream of parts. None of the bosses in this game are incredible. They tend to have very simple patterns to them. They also have long invulnerability periods that freeze them in place, giving you a reprieve as long as you can hit them. This one is at least visually interesting and feels threatening, but I get the impression they wanted this boss to be more memorable than difficult. After enough damage, the spook will be exorcised and we can retrieve the Viking diary from the captain, except he was apparently lying to us. The diary is actually at the South Pole. As a consolation, he gives us an ancient Viking plunger, which I am convinced is a joke even if the delivery isn't the best. In any case, we can head back to the South Pole and put this plunger to action. The big upgrade with this ancient green plunger is that it can stick to ceilings and apparently birds as well. This allows us to hitch a ride with this bird over this chasm. We do need to dodge up and down through this section, but it's not very difficult. On the other side, we get to our first actually difficult platforming challenge of the game. The ice through here is broken with the choppy Arctic Sea exposed in the holes. Donald has to jump carefully across these icy platforms, timing his jumps to not fall in. There are also orcas in the water, eager to swallow you like a seal, and this is the first time I have seen a game use orcas as a threat. And then again, Free Willy was still 2 years away, and that really changed people's opinions of what an orca was. This level is where I died the most in this playthrough because there are moving platforms towards the end that really mess with your timing. The rest of the level you can move through without stopping, but here you have to pause or you'll be a frozen duck. And that's tricky with this slippery ice physics. Once you make it across the ice, you'll find a little maze area in this cave that makes use of the bubbles again. Donald can break the blue ice blocks with him to explore this cave, dodging Russian goons and angry sea lions. A lot of the passageways through here are very narrow, making navigation tricky. It does feel like we are exploring a hidden icy cave. The Viking diary is well hidden towards the end of this area, and you can't even see it until the ice is broken. With the diary finally in hand, Donald can escape the cave, only to find out that Pete has caught up with him and captured his nephews. What a jerk! He demands the treasure map and diary in return for the boy, so of course Donald hands them over. He's really just a softie. This is actually another adventure movie trope, that third act twist where the hero is put at a disadvantage right when he thought he was about to triumph. Really though, this is just a minor setback, as Donald and the triplets manage to follow Pete to his base, which is apparently in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This island feels wild and untamed, the music weird and discordant. It makes for an effectively exotic environment. Donald has to face jumping blocks, hitch a ride on another bird, dodge piranhas and snakes, falling bridges. This island has a good treacherous feel to it. It's a very effective escalation from the earlier levels. Towards the end of this section, Donald rides a pulley down into a gorge which drops him off the entrance to Pete's base. Immediately, the environment becomes more industrial as Donald rides a minecart deeper inside. This next section is one that haunted me as a child. There's a large chasm to cross with nothing to help you but these floating platforms. They expand and contract every few seconds, and you need to cross them carefully or plummet to your doom. This whole base feels a little ramshackle here, with wooden elements, girders, and strange tanks full of liquids. It's all a bit mismatched in a way that signals a base that was thrown together with little care for aesthetics. The last jump in this section is particularly tricky. It's a bit too far, so you need to go down first to give yourself a platform to jump up to the exit. This next section is even more of a hodgepodge, this time with enemies. There's nothing much to say about this first part, just take your time as you advance past the goons. Past that, Donald has to navigate through some narrow passageways, and there's also a decoy pit that you don't want to try because it will drop you into oblivion. This section ends with an elevator ride upwards. The elevator will only rise when Donald is standing on it, so you have to jump to regulate its movement and attack the goons. Nothing too complicated, but it is tricky to avoid damage here. Up at the top of this shaft is our confrontation with Pete, and he terrified me as a kid. He's riding this machine with a crushing piston that will attempt to flatten Donald if he is underneath. However, he can only travel along these black tracks in the background, limiting his movement quite a bit. You need to guide him to this upper section of the area so you can peg him in the face with a plunger, and honestly, what mob boss wants a plunger to the face? This boss is definitely the hardest one so far. You have to keep moving constantly to stay ahead, and also guide Pete to an advantageous position. Pete feels relentless, always chasing you down. He's been trouble for the entire game, and it feels good to conquer him as an adult. After enough hits, Pete will go down and Donald will retrieve the diary. With that in hand, Donald is stuck in this room. This is a bit of a tricky situation as nothing tells you what to do. You're just stuck in this room forever until you figure it out. The trick is you have to remember that this game was inspired by old school adventure games, and when you're stuck in one of those, you need to check your inventory. Sure enough, the diary is there, and reading it will reveal the secret of the map. Exposing it to water will reveal the treasure's final location. It's a silly little thing, but I like the way it echoes classic adventures with hidden messages. It turns out the treasure is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, the southern Atlantic, very far from Rapture. Landing on this island, we immediately get a very different vibe from our last mysterious island. And this is actually impressive because it would have been easy for these two islands to feel similar, but they each have their own unique environment. The music here is slower, more mysterious. You get the feeling that something could jump out at you at any moment. And the longer you go without that happening, the tension just keeps rising and rising. After climbing this slope, we find these leaves hanging in midair. Donald can jump across them, but they will quickly fall, so you need to hurry. Past these, there will be some rotten wood to fall through, and then some more collapsing platforms to jump up. All these dangerous collapsing platforms manage to make this island feel properly treacherous. After this climb, we head into the final temple. And this place is just chock full of traps. We've got those spike traps from earlier ready to trip us up all over again. There's a fun little ride on a pulley across a vine. A small army of these living statue things. These are tricky because they have a shield that will attempt to block your plunger, either high or low. To stun them, you have to hit wherever they aren't blocking. And of course we have another classic from this video game, floating flames. Combined with the music, it all presents a very ominous and treacherous feeling. It's very appropriate for a final level. You can feel the tension and anticipation rising as you move through it. The last challenge in here are these moving walls. You need to climb up them pretty quickly or get squashed. Hopefully you will notice this passageway up above, as this is your exit. Through this door we get a scene right out of Indiana Jones with a vast open canyon and a leap of faith. The only way across is these disappearing platforms. They only become visible when you approach, so you need to be very careful as you cross. They do vary the distance, just enough to catch you off guard if you are careless. This section manages to feel dangerous and climactic, which is good because through this last door we find the final boss. The room looks like some kind of altar, and as we enter, the statue in the center comes to life, spinning its sword as he approaches. After a few moments he will throw it, which is easy to dodge, but the rocks it shakes loose from the ceiling are a bit harder to avoid as they bounce down the steps. You need to hit this, whatever he is, in the face with a plunger, but he's only vulnerable when he isn't holding his sword. As I fight this guy, I'd like to tell you how I used to play this game back when I was very young. You see, I used to play this game with my father. He wasn't much of a gamer, but he tried because he knew I liked games and wanted to share that with me. He was always more of an arcade guy, and I know he liked Pac-Man a lot. More complicated games like this weren't really his cup of tea. When we played this game together, I would do most of the game, but there were always a few parts where he would step in and do for me because they were just too hard. One of them was that Pete fight from earlier, but this final boss was another. My dad would always handle him for me, and that was the only way I ever beat this game as a child. It's been years since I played this game, and years since my father passed away. This is actually the first time I've ever beaten this game on my own, and it brought back so many memories of a good man who died far too soon. I love my dad, and I miss him, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this silly little Disney game that few people have ever heard of. If you can survive the rubble and keep your attacks up, Donald will emerge victorious, deemed worthy to claim the lost treasure. Unfortunately, it turns out to just be a useless statue of a duck princess. Bummer. Donald sulks all the way back to Duckberg to confront Daisy, who really wants that present she was promised. At first, she is upset by the statue, but then the boys drop it and crack it open, revealing the priceless necklace inside. I guess Donald won't be sleeping on the couch after all. And that's it for Quackshot, nothing left but the credits. This little game hasn't made much of a mark on history, but you can tell a lot of care was put into the development. The art is nice, the controls are tight, there are some interesting ideas at play. It's everything a kid from the 90s could want from a video game. I mean, there were certainly mountains of games worse than this. Let me tell you, you were always rolling the dice when you picked up a random game from Blockbuster. But this game also stands as an interesting footnote in the lives of some people who went on to be involved in much bigger projects. If you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed this little nostalgic trip. Now that this video is done, I'm going to go back to reviewing indie games for a little bit. But I do have some more bigger projects in the works, so if you like what I do, give me a follow so you'll be informed when those come out. My next video is going to be a very weird game that may or may not star Jesus Christ himself. That's all for me this time. I hope you have a great day. Go out there and live your best life like Donald, an imperfect duck that always tries his best.